The complete history of the Cold War, a global standoff that lasted decades. History to Sleep. Good evening and welcome to Boring History to Sleep. Tonight, we will be examining a conflict that was never formally declared. A war fought not primarily with soldiers and tanks on a single battlefield, but with spies and scientists, with propaganda and proxy armies on every continent of the globe. It was a struggle that lasted for nearly half a century, a long twilight struggle, as one of its central figures would call it, that held the entire world hostage to the terrifying possibility of nuclear annihilation. This is the complete history of the Cold War. We will trace the origins of this great ideological divide, from the smoldering ashes of the Second World War to the sudden, breathtaking collapse of a superpower. Before we delve into this era of tension and shadow, we'd love to know where in the world you are listening from tonight. What is the time, and what is the weather like outside your window as you settle in? Let us know in the comments below. Now, find your place of rest. Allow the world to go quiet. Take a slow, deep breath and release it. Our story begins not with an act of aggression, but with the death of an alliance, a moment when the shared victory of the world's greatest war gave way to a profound and chilling mistrust. Chapter 1. The Iron Curtain. Descends the Shattered Alliance, 1945-1947. The year is 1945. The most destructive war in human history is grinding to its brutal conclusion. Cities across Europe lie in ruins, their skylines jagged and broken, the streets filled with rubble and the ghosts of millions dead. In the East, the once unstoppable German war machine has been systematically crushed and rolled back by the immense, seemingly inexhaustible power of the Soviet Red Army. In the West, the combined might of the American, British, and other Allied forces, having stormed the beaches of Normandy, has liberated France and pushed deep into the heart of Germany. The leaders of this victorious Grand Alliance, the United States, Great Britain, and the Soviet Union, were bound together not by shared values but by a shared existential enemy. On one side stood the Western democracies, led by the charismatic and increasingly frail American President Franklin D. Roosevelt and the bulldog-like British Prime Minister Winston Churchill. They represented a world of free market capitalism, individual liberties, and multi-party democracy. On the other side stood the Soviet Union, a vast totalitarian state forged in revolution and civil war, ruled with an iron fist by the shrewd and utterly ruthless dictator Joseph Stalin. It was a communist state, founded on the ideology of Karl Marx, which preached the overthrow of capitalism and the establishment of a classless, state-controlled society. This alliance of convenience, this shotgun wedding of capitalism and communism, was destined to fracture the moment their common enemy was defeated. The first cracks began to appear even before the war was over, at the Yalta Conference in February 1945. The Big Three, Roosevelt, Churchill, and Stalin, met in a former Tsarist palace on the coast of the Black Sea to sketch out the map of the post-war world. The atmosphere was one of cautious optimism, but underneath, the currents of mistrust ran deep. Roosevelt, a man of great charm and confidence, believed he could build a personal rapport with Stalin and coax him into cooperating in a new world order based on the principles of the United Nations. Churchill, ever the hardened realist and a lifelong anti-communist, was far more suspicious. He saw the Red Army's unstoppable advance across Eastern Europe not just as a liberation, but as a new form of occupation. The central and most contentious issue was the fate of Poland. For Britain, the war had begun with the invasion of Poland. Its freedom was a matter of national honor. For Stalin, Poland was a matter of national security. It was a historical corridor through which invading armies had twice marched on Russia in a generation. He was absolutely determined to have a friendly, pro-Soviet government in Warsaw, regardless of the wishes of the Polish people themselves. At Yalta, a vague compromise was reached. Stalin agreed to allow some members of the non-communist Polish government in exile to join the new government and pledged to hold free and unfettered elections in the liberated nations of Eastern Europe. Roosevelt and Churchill, with the Red Army already in physical control of the region, had little choice but to accept his word. It was a promise that Stalin had no intention of keeping. By the time the leaders met again at Potsdam in the summer of 1945, the world had changed. Roosevelt was dead, replaced by his vice president, Harry S. Truman, a plain-spoken former senator from Missouri, who was far less experienced in foreign affairs and far more skeptical of Soviet intentions. Halfway through the conference, Churchill's Conservative Party was defeated in a surprise election, and he was replaced by the new Labor Prime Minister, Clement Attlee. The atmosphere at Potsdam was colder, more confrontational. The disagreements were no longer veiled in diplomatic language. It was clear that Stalin was systematically installing loyal, communist-dominated puppet governments in every country his army occupied. Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, and the eastern part of Germany. The promised free elections were a sham. The deep ideological chasm between the two sides was now a gaping political reality. But the most significant event of the Potsdam Conference happened away from the negotiating table. On July 16th, President Truman received a coded message informing him that the United States had successfully tested a new and terrifying weapon in the New Mexico desert. He casually walked over to Stalin and informed him that the U.S. now possessed a new weapon of unusual, destructive force. Stalin, who already knew about the Manhattan Project through his network of spies, feigned a lack of interest, but the strategic calculus of the entire world had shifted in that moment. On August 6th and 9th, 1945, the United States dropped atomic bombs on the Japanese cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, bringing the war in the Pacific to an abrupt end. The bombs were not only the final act of the Second World War, they were the opening shot of the Cold War. They demonstrated to the world, and specifically to the Soviet Union, that the United States now held a monopoly on a weapon of unimaginable power, a weapon that could wipe entire cities off the map in the blink of an eye. In the months following the end of the war, the fragile peace deteriorated rapidly. Stalin, consolidating his grip on Eastern Europe, declared in a speech in early 1946 that communism and capitalism were incompatible and that future wars were inevitable. This was seen in the West as a virtual declaration of a new ideological war. Just a few weeks later, Winston Churchill, now out of office, traveled to Fulton, Missouri, and delivered a speech that would give a name to the new reality dividing the continent. He declared that from Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that curtain, he said, the ancient capitals of Central and Eastern Europe were now subject to Soviet control and police governments. The metaphor was powerful and enduring. It captured the sense of a world suddenly and brutally divided, not just by armies and borders, but by an impenetrable barrier of ideology, secrecy, and fear. The West saw the Soviet Union as an expansionist, totalitarian power, bent on world domination, a new red fascism that had simply replaced the Nazi threat. The Soviet Union, having suffered unimaginable devastation in the war with over 27 million dead, saw the West, with its atomic monopoly and its global network of military bases, as a hostile, capitalist encirclement, determined to strangle the world's first communist state at birth. The Grand Alliance was shattered beyond repair. The soldiers who had shaken hands as comrades on the banks of the Elbe River just a year before now found themselves glaring at each other across a fortified border. The shared victory had left two superpowers standing, each with a fundamentally different vision for the future of humanity. The stage was set for a new kind of global conflict, a long, tense, and dangerous struggle for the soul of the post-war world. Chapter 2. Containment and Confrontation. The lines are drawn, 1947-1953. With Churchill's Iron Curtain speech, the new geopolitical reality had been given a name, but the West still lacked a coherent strategy to deal with it. The United States, which had demobilized its vast armies at a breathtaking speed after the war, was now faced with a Soviet Union that maintained a massive conventional military force and was actively working to expand its influence beyond the borders of Eastern Europe. The first major tests of this new reality came in the Eastern Mediterranean. In Greece, a brutal civil war was raging between the British-backed royalist government and communist-led insurgents. In neighboring Turkey, Stalin was applying intense diplomatic pressure, demanding territorial concessions and joint control of the strategic Turkish Straits, which connected the Black Sea to the Mediterranean. Great Britain, exhausted and bankrupted by the war, informed the United States in early 1947 that it could no longer afford to provide military and economic aid to these countries. The torch of global leadership was being passed, and it was up to Washington to decide whether to pick it up. The intellectual framework for America's new role was provided by a brilliant and somewhat reclusive State Department official named George F. Kennan. In 1946, while serving in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow, Kennan had sent a famous long telegram back to Washington, a sprawling 8,000-word analysis of the Soviet mindset. He argued that the Soviet Union was driven by a combination of traditional Russian insecurity and a messianic communist ideology that saw the world in a state of perpetual conflict with capitalism. He concluded that the Soviets could not be reasoned with or appeased, but that they were also pragmatic and would pull back when faced with strong resistance. The correct strategy, he argued, was one of a long-term, patient, but firm and vigilant containment of Russian expansive tendencies. This concept of containment became the central pillar of American foreign policy for the next 40 years. Its first concrete application was announced by President Truman in a speech to Congress on March 12, 1947. In what became known as the Truman Doctrine, he declared that it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures. He requested and received $400 million in aid for Greece and Turkey. The United States had officially committed itself to preventing the further spread of communism anywhere in the world. But containment was not just a military strategy, it was also an economic one. American policymakers, led by Secretary of State George C. Marshall, recognized that the devastated economies of Western Europe were fertile ground for communist parties, which were gaining popularity in countries like France and Italy by promising radical solutions to the widespread poverty and despair. To counter this, Marshall announced a bold and unprecedented new program in a speech at Harvard University in June 1947. The European Recovery Program, universally known as the Marshall Plan, would offer massive amounts of American financial aid to help rebuild the economies of Europe. It was an act of both extraordinary generosity and brilliant self-interest. By restoring economic stability and prosperity, the United States hoped to inoculate Western Europe against the appeal of communism and to create strong, reliable trading partners. The plan was a spectacular success, fueling what became known as the post-war economic miracle in Western Europe. But it also deepened the division of the continent. The Soviet Union, viewing the plan as a form of American economic imperialism, forbade the countries of Eastern Europe from participating, forcing them instead into their own, much poorer economic bloc. The first direct high-stakes confrontation of the Cold War came in the divided city of Berlin. The city, like Germany as a whole, had been divided into 4 zones of occupation after the war, but it was located deep inside the Soviet-controlled sector of East Germany. In 1948, the Western powers, the U.S., Britain, and France, announced their intention to create a new, unified currency in their zones to help spur economic recovery, a prelude to the creation of a new West German state. Stalin saw this as a direct threat. In June 1948, he decided to force the Western powers out of the city. He cut off all road, rail, and canal access to West Berlin, which was home to over 2 million people, effectively laying siege to the city. He believed the West would have no choice but to abandon their sectors, handing him a major propaganda victory. It was a massive gamble, but Truman refused to back down. A direct military confrontation to open the roads would have risked a full-scale war. Instead, he opted for an audacious and unprecedented solution: to supply the entire city from the air. This was the beginning of the Berlin airlift. For the next 11 months, in a stunning logistical feat, American and British cargo planes flew round-the-clock missions into the besieged city. In the early days, the pilots flew in fog and bad weather, landing on makeshift runways. At the peak of the airlift, a plane was landing at Tempelhof Airport every 63 seconds. They carried everything the city needed to survive: food, coal, medicine, and industrial supplies. The image of the candy bombers, pilots who would drop small parachutes with candy for the children of Berlin, became a powerful symbol of American goodwill. The airlift was a spectacular political and humanitarian triumph for the West. It demonstrated American resolve and technological superiority, and it won the hearts and minds of the German people. In May 1949, a humiliated Stalin lifted the blockade. The Berlin crisis accelerated the formal division of Europe into 2 hostile military alliances. In April 1949, the United States, Canada, and 10 Western European nations signed the North Atlantic Treaty, creating NATO, a collective security pact which stated that an attack on any one member would be considered an attack on all. For the first time in its history, the United States had entered into a peacetime military alliance. The Soviet Union responded in 1955 by creating its own formal alliance, the Warsaw Pact, which bound the nations of Eastern Europe into a unified military command under Moscow's control. The lines were now clearly and formally drawn. This grim new reality was underscored by two shocking events in the second half of 1949. In August, the Soviet Union successfully detonated its first atomic bomb, years earlier than American intelligence had predicted. The American nuclear monopoly was over. Then, in October, the long and brutal Chinese Civil War ended with a victory for the communist forces led by Mao Zedong. The world's most populous nation was now a communist state, and many in the West saw this as a massive expansion of a monolithic global communist bloc controlled from Moscow. The Cold War had entered a new, more dangerous phase. The fear and paranoia in the United States reached a fever pitch, fueling the rise of Senator Joseph McCarthy and a new Red Scare. And the conflict was about to turn hot. In June 1950, the communist state of North Korea, with the backing of the Soviet Union and China, invaded its southern non-communist neighbor. The Korean War had begun, the first major armed conflict of the Cold War, a brutal proxy war in which the superpowers would test each other's resolve on a foreign battlefield at the cost of millions of lives. Chapter 3. Brinksmanship and the Balance of Terror, The Age of Fear, 1953-1962. The death of Joseph Stalin in March 1953 sent a shockwave through the communist world and briefly raised hopes in the West for a thaw in the Cold War. But the decade that followed would prove to be the most dangerous period of the entire conflict. An era of terrifying technological leaps, superpower confrontations, and a pervasive, globe-spanning culture of fear. This was the age of brinksmanship, a time when the world was pushed repeatedly to the very edge of nuclear abyss. Stalin was succeeded by a collective leadership from which a new and very different kind of Soviet leader emerged, Nikita Khrushchev. A stout, boisterous, and often crude man, Khrushchev denounced the crimes of the Stalin era in a secret speech in 1956 and initiated a period of de-Stalinization. But while he was less brutal at home, he was no less committed to the ideological struggle with the West. He was a true believer in the superiority of the communist system, famously boasting to Western ambassadors, "We will bury you," a phrase that, while he claimed it referred to economic competition, sent a chill down the spine of a world already on edge. The central and most terrifying feature of this era was the escalating nuclear arms race. In 1952, the United States had tested the first hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, a thermonuclear device with a destructive power 1,000 times greater than the atomic bomb that had destroyed Hiroshima. The Soviet Union followed with its own H-bomb just a year later. The superpowers were now in possession of weapons that could not just destroy cities, but potentially end human civilization itself. This new reality gave rise to a chilling strategic doctrine known as mutually assured destruction, or MAD. The logic was simple and insane. Both sides were developing the capacity to launch a devastating nuclear strike against the other, even after suffering a first strike themselves. This was achieved through a nuclear triad of long-range bombers, land-based intercontinental ballistic missiles, ICBMs, and submarine-launched ballistic missiles. since any nuclear attack would inevitably result in the total destruction of both the attacker and the defender. A rational leader would never be the first to launch. The world's safety now rested on a precarious balance of terror, a promise of shared annihilation that was supposed to keep the peace. This nuclear standoff created a pervasive culture of fear that seeped into every aspect of daily life. In the United States, schoolchildren practiced duck and cover drills, hiding under their desks in a futile preparation for a nuclear blast. Families built fallout shelters in their backyards, stocking them with canned goods and water. The fear of unseen communist infiltration, fanned by McCarthyism, led to loyalty oaths, blacklists, and a stifling atmosphere of political conformity. The ideological competition also moved into a new and highly visible arena, outer space. In October 1957, the world was stunned by the news that the Soviet Union had successfully launched the first artificial satellite, a small beach ball-sized sphere called Sputnik, into orbit around the Earth. The beeping signal from Sputnik as it passed overhead was a profound psychological blow to the United States. It shattered the comfortable assumption of American technological superiority and sparked a wave of national anxiety. If the Soviets could put a satellite into orbit, it meant they had rockets powerful enough to launch a nuclear warhead at the United States. This Sputnik crisis led to a massive overhaul of American education, with a new emphasis on science and math, and to the creation of a new government agency to lead the American space effort, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, or NASA. The space race was on. The Soviets scored another stunning victory in April 1961, when cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin became the first human being to orbit the Earth. A few weeks later, President John F. Kennedy, the young dynamic new leader of the United States, stood before Congress and committed the nation to achieving a bold and audacious goal before the decade was out: landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth. The race to the moon was more than a scientific endeavor. It was a central battleground of the Cold War, a test of which system, capitalism or communism, could achieve the impossible. While the superpowers competed in the heavens, the confrontations on Earth grew more perilous. The divided city of Berlin remained a volatile flashpoint. West, Berlin was a prosperous, democratic island deep inside the grim, repressive state of East Germany. It was also an escape hatch. Every day, thousands of East Germans, particularly the young and the educated, were simply taking a subway or walking across the open border into West Berlin and to freedom. This brain drain was a demographic and propaganda disaster for the communist regime. In the early morning hours of August 13, 1961, East German soldiers and police, under Khrushchev's orders, began to unroll barbed wire and erect barricades, sealing off the border between East and West Berlin. The makeshift barriers were soon replaced by a formidable concrete wall, complete with watchtowers, guard dogs, and a death strip of mined territory. The Berlin Wall became the most potent and ugly physical symbol of the Cold War, a concrete manifestation of the Iron Curtain. For the next 28 years it would stand as a monument to the failure of communism, a prison wall designed not to keep enemies out, but to keep its own people in. But the moment when the Cold War came closest to turning hot, the moment when the hands of the doomsday clock moved to a minute to midnight, came in October 1962, on an island just 90 miles from the coast of Florida. For 13 terrifying days, the world held its breath during the Cuban Missile Crisis. After Fidel Castro's communist revolution in Cuba in 1959 and the failed American-backed Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, Khrushchev had made a secret and incredibly reckless decision to place Soviet medium-range nuclear missiles in Cuba. These missiles would be capable of reaching Washington, D.C. and most other major American cities in a matter of minutes, drastically altering the strategic balance of power. On October 14, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane flying over Cuba took photographs that revealed the missile sites under construction. When President Kennedy was shown the evidence, he knew he was facing the gravest crisis of his presidency, and perhaps of human history. He convened a secret group of his most trusted advisors, known as XCOM, to debate the options. Some military leaders, like General Curtis LeMay, argued for an immediate, massive airstrike to destroy the sites, followed by an invasion of Cuba. Kennedy, aware that this would almost certainly lead to a full-scale nuclear war with the Soviet Union, resisted this pressure. Instead, he chose a more measured, but still incredibly risky, course of action. On October 22nd, he went on national television and revealed the existence of the missiles to a shocked American public and the world. He announced that he was imposing a naval quarantine, a less belligerent term than blockade, around Cuba, to prevent any more Soviet ships from delivering military equipment. He made it clear that any missile launched from Cuba would be regarded as an attack by the Soviet Union on the United States, requiring a full retaliatory response. For the next week, the world stood on the brink. Soviet ships carrying missile parts steamed toward the quarantine line, shadowed by the U.S. Navy. American military forces were placed on their highest level of alert, DEFCON 2, one step short of a nuclear war. B-52 bombers armed with nuclear weapons were in the air 24 hours a day. The tension was almost unbearable. The crisis reached its peak on October 27th, Black Saturday. A U-2 spy plane was shot down over Cuba, killing the pilot. An American naval vessel dropped depth charges on a Soviet submarine, which, unknown to the Americans, was armed with a nuclear torpedo and was only prevented from launching it by the single dissenting vote of one of its 3 senior officers. The world was a hair's breadth from catastrophe, but behind the scenes, a desperate, secret back-channel negotiation was taking place. Through a series of letters and intermediaries, Kennedy and Khrushchev managed to find a way to step back from the brink. Khrushchev agreed to remove the missiles from Cuba in exchange for a public U.S. pledge not to invade the island. In a secret additional part of the deal, Kennedy also agreed to remove obsolete American Jupiter missiles from Turkey at a later date. On October 28th, Khrushchev announced over Radio Moscow that the missiles would be dismantled. The crisis was over. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief. The Cuban Missile Crisis was a terrifying wake-up call for both superpowers. It showed them just how easily a confrontation could spin out of control and lead to unimaginable horror. In the aftermath, a new sense of caution entered their relationship. A direct telephone hotline was established between the White House and the Kremlin to allow for instant communication in a crisis. And in 1963, they signed the first major arms control agreement of the Cold War, the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which prohibited nuclear weapons tests in the atmosphere, in outer space, and underwater. The Age of Fear was not over, but its most acute and dangerous phase had passed. The superpowers had looked into the abyss, and they had pulled back, choosing coexistence over co-annihilation. Chapter 4. The Quagmire and the Thaw, The Long Twilight Struggle, 1963 to 1979. The terrifying brush with nuclear Armageddon in Cuba fundamentally altered the nature of the Cold War. The superpowers, sobered by the experience, largely avoided direct high-stakes confrontations for the next decade and a half. The central arena of their conflict shifted away from Europe and towards a developing world, the so-called Third World, of Asia, Africa, and Latin America. It was here, in a series of brutal and protracted proxy wars, that the ideological struggle would be fought, often at a devastating cost to the local populations caught in the middle. And no conflict would come to define this era more, or leave a deeper and more painful scar on the American psyche than the war in Vietnam. The roots of the Vietnam War were long and complex, stretching back to the era of French colonialism. After the French were defeated by Vietnamese nationalist forces led by the communist Ho Chi Minh in 1954, the country was partitioned, much like Korea, into a communist North and a non-communist American-backed South. The United States, operating under the domino theory, the belief that if one country in Southeast Asia fell to communism, the rest would quickly follow, became increasingly committed to preserving the fragile and corrupt government in South Vietnam. What began as a small advisory role under Presidents Eisenhower and Kennedy escalated dramatically under President Lyndon B. Johnson. After a disputed naval incident in the Gulf of Tonkin in 1964, Johnson secured a congressional resolution that gave him broad authority to wage war. He began a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam, and in 1965 sent the first American combat troops to the South. The United States plunged into a war unlike any it had ever fought before. It was a war with no clear front lines, fought against a tenacious and elusive guerrilla enemy, the Viet Cong, who were supported by the regular army of North Vietnam, which in turn was supplied by the Soviet Union and China. American military strategy was based on overwhelming firepower and a grim arithmetic of body counts, believing that a war of attrition could wear the enemy down. But they were fighting an enemy who was willing to endure almost unimaginable losses for the cause of national reunification. For the American soldiers on the ground, it was a brutal and disorienting experience. A quagmire of jungle patrols, booby traps, and sudden terrifying ambushes. The turning point of the war came in early 1968 with the Tet Offensive. In a massive, coordinated surprise attack, Communist forces struck dozens of cities and towns across South Vietnam, even briefly penetrating the grounds of the U.S. Embassy in Saigon. Militarily, the offensive was a failure for the Communists, who suffered devastating casualties. But politically and psychologically, it was a stunning victory. The sheer scale of the attack shattered the optimistic pronouncements of American generals and politicians that there was light at the end of the tunnel. It proved that the enemy was far from defeated, and that the war was nowhere near its end. Back in the United States, the Tet Offensive broke the back of public support for the war. The anti-war movement, which had been growing on college campuses and in cities across the country, swelled into a massive, mainstream force. the nation became bitterly divided between hawks who supported the war and doves who demanded its end. The nightly television news brought the brutal reality of the conflict, the living room war, into American homes, further eroding support. The war would drag on for another 7 painful years under President Richard Nixon, who pursued a policy of Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops while increasing bombing and support for the South Vietnamese Army. In 1973, a peace accord was signed in Paris, and the last American combat troops left Vietnam. 2 years later, in April 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the presidential palace in Saigon, and the war was finally over. The United States had suffered its first clear military defeat. The war had cost the lives of over 58,000 Americans and an estimated 2 to 3 million Vietnamese. It had left America's confidence shaken, its society divided, and its moral authority in the world severely damaged. While the United States was bogged down in Vietnam, the broader landscape of the Cold War was undergoing a surprising and complex realignment. The monolithic communist bloc, so feared in the 1950s, had fractured. A deep ideological and geopolitical rivalry had developed between the Soviet Union and the People's Republic of China. The Sino-Soviet split created a new three-way dynamic in global politics. President Nixon and his brilliant national security advisor, Henry Kissinger, saw this as a major opportunity. They decided to play the China card, seeking to normalize relations with Mao Zedong's communist government in order to gain leverage over the Soviet Union. In a stunning diplomatic breakthrough, Nixon made a historic visit to China in 1972, ending 2 decades of hostility and isolation. This new, more pragmatic approach to foreign policy gave rise to a period known as détente, a French word meaning a relaxation of tensions. Nixon and the Soviet leader, Leonid Brezhnev, sought to manage their rivalry and reduce the risk of nuclear war through a series of negotiations and agreements. The most significant of these was the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, or SALT-Y, signed in 1972, which for the first time placed limits on the number of ICBMs and submarine-launched missiles that each side could deploy. This was followed by the Helsinki Accords in 1975, in which the Soviet Union and the nations of Eastern Europe formally agreed to recognize basic human rights, a concession that, while largely ignored by the communist regimes at the time, would later be used by dissident groups to challenge their legitimacy. But détente was a fragile and limited affair. The ideological competition and the proxy wars continued unabated. The superpowers continued to back opposing sides in conflicts across the globe, from the Yom Kippur War in the Middle East in 1973, which brought the U.S. and the USSR to a tense nuclear alert, to civil wars in Angola and Mozambique in Africa. By the late 1970s, the spirit of détente was fading. A new generation of hardliners was gaining influence in both Washington and Moscow. And in December 1979, the Soviet Union made a fateful and disastrous decision that would shatter the last remnants of the thaw and plunge the world into a new and final phase of the Cold War. The Red Army invaded its southern neighbor, Afghanistan, to prop up a failing communist regime. For the United States, this was an act of naked aggression, a move to expand Soviet influence toward the vital oil fields of the Persian Gulf. Détente was officially dead. The long twilight struggle was about to enter its final, and perhaps most unpredictable, act. Chapter 5, The final act, The Wall Comes Down, 1980-1991. The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 marked the beginning of what some historians have called the Second Cold War. The era of détente was over, replaced by a renewed period of intense hostility and a massive new arms race. The American response was swift and punitive. President Jimmy Carter withdrew the SALT II Treaty from Senate consideration, imposed economic sanctions on the Soviet Union, and announced an American boycott of the 1980 Moscow Olympics. The CIA, in what would become its largest covert operation in history, began to secretly fund and arm the Afghan resistance fighters, the Mujahideen, bogging the Soviet army down in a costly and demoralizing guerrilla war that would become known as the Soviet Union's Vietnam. The shift to a more confrontational stance was personified by the man who was elected U.S. President in 1980, Ronald Reagan. Reagan, a former actor and a staunch conservative, came to office with a clear and uncompromising view of the Cold War. He rejected the moral equivalency of détente and saw the conflict in stark, black-and-white terms. He famously described the Soviet Union as an evil empire and the focus of evil in the modern world. He believed that the previous policy of containment had been too passive. His goal was not just to contain the Soviet Union, but to defeat it. He initiated the largest peacetime military buildup in American history, pouring trillions of dollars into new weapon systems, including the B-1 bomber and the MX missile. His most ambitious and controversial proposal was the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, announced in 1983. Dubbed Star Wars by its critics, SDI was a futuristic and technologically daunting plan to build a space-based shield of lasers and particle beams that could shoot down incoming Soviet missiles, theoretically rendering nuclear weapons obsolete. While most scientists believed it was unworkable, the prospect of an all-out technological arms race with the far wealthier United States sent a shock of fear through the Kremlin. This new, hardline American posture, combined with the draining war in Afghanistan and a deeply stagnant domestic economy, placed the Soviet Union under immense strain. The country was ruled by a succession of old, frail, and unimaginative leaders from the Brezhnev era. The Soviet system, with its rigid central planning and its crushing of all dissent, was sclerotic and decaying from within. The shelves in state-run stores were often empty, and a deep cynicism and apathy pervaded the population. The gap between the communist promise of a worker's paradise and the grim reality of daily life had become a chasm. Then, in 1985, a new and dramatically different kind of leader came to power in the Soviet Union. Mikhail Gorbachev was, at 54, the youngest member of the Politburo. He was energetic, intelligent, and, unlike his predecessors, he understood that the Soviet system was in a state of profound crisis and needed radical reform if it was to survive. Gorbachev launched a two-pronged program of revolutionary change. The first was perestroika, or restructuring, a series of economic reforms aimed at introducing elements of free market capitalism and decentralizing the moribund state-controlled economy. The second, and far more explosive, was glasnost, or openness. This was a new policy of encouraging public discussion and criticism of the country's problems. Gorbachev believed that by allowing a greater degree of freedom of speech and expression, he could energize the Soviet people and build support for his economic reforms. He had no intention of dismantling the communist system, but by opening the floodgates of public discourse, he had unleashed forces that he would soon be unable to control. Gorbachev also sought to fundamentally change the relationship with the West. He knew that the Soviet Union could no longer afford the crippling expense of the arms race. He began a series of high-profile summit meetings with Ronald Reagan. Their first meeting in Geneva in 1985 was chilly, but established a surprising personal rapport. Their second, in Reykjavik, Iceland, in 1986, nearly resulted in a breathtaking agreement to eliminate all nuclear weapons, but it collapsed at the last minute over Reagan's refusal to abandon SDI. Finally, in 1987, they signed the landmark Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces (INF) Treaty, which for the first time eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons. Gorbachev also made it clear that the Soviet Union would no longer use force to prop up the unpopular communist regimes in Eastern Europe. The Brezhnev Doctrine was dead. This was the signal that the people of the Eastern Bloc had been waiting for 40 years. The year 1989 was a political earthquake, a year in which the entire post-war order collapsed with a speed that left the world breathless. It began in Poland, where the long-suppressed Solidarity trade union movement, led by Lech Wałęsa, forced the communist government into free elections, which Solidarity won in a landslide. Then, in Hungary, the government began to dismantle the barbed wire fences on its border with Austria, creating the first tear in the Iron Curtain. Thousands of East Germans began to pour into Hungary on their way to freedom in the West. In Czechoslovakia, massive, peaceful demonstrations filled the streets of Prague in what became known as the Velvet Revolution, which brought the dissident playwright Václav Havel to power. But the most iconic and emotionally powerful moment of that revolutionary year came on the night of November 9, 1989, in the city that had been the ultimate symbol of the Cold War's division, Berlin. After a bungled announcement by a mid-level East German party official, who mistakenly told a press conference that the border was immediately open, massive crowds of jubilant East Berliners swarmed the checkpoints of the Berlin Wall. The overwhelmed and confused border guards, with no clear orders to shoot, simply opened the gates. The scenes that followed were broadcast live around the world. East and West Berliners wept, hugged, and danced together on top of the hated wall. People began to attack the structure with sledgehammers and pickaxes, chipping away at the concrete symbol of their decades of division. The fall of the Berlin Wall was the symbolic end of the Cold War. The collapse of the rest of the Soviet Empire followed with astonishing speed. The communist regimes in Bulgaria and Romania fell. The Baltic states of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia declared their independence. The two Germanys were reunified in 1990. Gorbachev, the man who had set all this in motion, found himself increasingly powerless. The forces of nationalism and democracy that he had unleashed had become a torrent. In August 1991, hardline communist old guards attempted to stage a coup to overthrow him and reverse the tide of history. The coup failed, largely due to the defiance of Boris Yeltsin, the popularly elected president of the Russian Republic, who famously stood on a tank outside the Russian parliament building and rallied the people against the plotters. The failed coup shattered the last vestiges of the Communist Party's authority. One by one, the remaining republics of the Soviet Union declared their independence. On Christmas Day, 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev went on television and announced his resignation as president of a country that no longer existed. The red flag with the hammer and sickle was lowered from the Kremlin for the last time, and the Soviet Union was officially dissolved. After 45 years, the Cold War was over. Not with a nuclear bang, but with the quiet whimper of a bankrupt and broken ideology. The world that had been defined for 2 generations by the struggle between 2 superpowers had been fundamentally and irrevocably changed. The long twilight struggle had come to an end. The fear of global annihilation that had haunted the sleep of millions had finally receded. The story of this great confrontation, with its spies and its secrets, its proxy wars and its peace talks, has now been told. Allow the weight of this history, the grand scale of its decades-long drama, to be a comforting and steady presence as you drift away. There are no more crises to analyze, no more walls to fall. There is only the stillness of the night and the promise of a peaceful rest. Let your mind be quiet. Let your body be still, and surrender to the deep and easy peace of sleep. Good night.